Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and I'm just taking a few moments to let you know that this clip that you will see after this introduction is from one of my online classes, and I've decided to edit them so that more people can benefit from these lectures that I deliver pretty much every week. So enjoy and let me know what you think about it. Thank you so much. Welcome to another class session, and today we have three stories, two stories and one poem to talk about. Okay, so we have Naguib Mahfouz's Zabalawi, then we have Alifa Riffat's My Word of the Unknown, and then Mahmoud Darwish's poem, The Identity Card. Now, I already had a video on identity cards, so that you probably already watched, but we're still partly in Africa because Egypt is part of Africa, okay? But it's also part of the Arab world and the Middle East. So two of our first authors are from Egypt, and then Mahmoud Darwish is from Palestine. Okay, so that's all three Arab writers. And now keep in mind, Naguib Mahfouz is also a Nobel laureate. So he won the Nobel Prize for Literature for his lifetime work, but his most prominent work that's available in translation is called The Children of the Alley, which is an allegorical story of three major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And the final part of the book, for which he got in trouble, is the rise of rationalism and science in opposition to religious thought. And that was his most prominent translated work. Now, another distinction to note is that in Egyptian Arabic has the ga sound. Classical Arabic doesn't have the ga sound. So in rest of the Islamic world, he's called Najib, but in the Egyptian Arabic, he's called Naguib Mahfouz. So keep that distinction in mind. If you hear that someone pronounced it Najib Mahfouz, that is also correct. And these linguistic distinctions are really interesting. If you go to India and Pakistan, and Hindi and Urdu are mutually understood, but there is no za sound in Hindi. So what is za in Hindi in Urdu becomes ja in Hindi. So, some useless information for you to take. So before I go into it, I'm hoping you all read the stories, so it would be better if we start with any of your questions that you might have. You can either unmute yourself and ask the questions, or just post it in the comments and I'll get to them. Now, Zabalawi as a term is kind of a diminutive term. It is used for someone who is either, one of my friends told me, someone who is mischievous or someone who is itinerant, who constantly moves. But the story is set in Cairo, which is one of the most historical cities in the world, right? And we have our protagonist who tells us that he has some kind of an illness. He's afflicted, we don't know what, but it's kind of terminal. And everyone has told him that there is only one person who can cure you, and that is Zabalawi, if you can find him. And so he goes to his father's acquaintances first, the lawyer, right, who tells him, I don't know who Zabalawi is, I don't care. And so then from there, he moves closer and closer to the inner part of Cairo through the artists, small traders, and finally he gets a clue that if he goes to such and such restaurant at such and such time, he might run into Zabalawi. What we also learn is that Zabalawi is constantly on the move. He's wanted by the law, but he's well loved by the people, especially the poor. And then towards the end of the story, we believe that he meets Zabalawi, who says, you must drink before I talk to you. And then in a dream, when he wakes up, he doesn't know whether it's real or was it a dream? And then the story ends with an open-ended ending where he says that I still need to find Zabalawi. So that's the story of Zabalawi, kind of a summation of that. Then if you go to Alifa Rifat also has an interesting story. When she grew up in a very conservative household, after she got married, her husband won't let her write, and she goes into this deep depression. But finally, when she's allowed to write, then she writes two collections of short stories and also becomes a prominent figure in Egyptian letters. If you read her story, it's part magic realism, part realistic. A couple is moving into this house, which kind of stands out. So it is a kind of a gothic story as well. And as they move in, they encounter this young woman with a child who is almost very possessive of the house and doesn't want to leave. And then we find out that the lady of the house then discovers that there is a snake that comes out of the wall and then takes human form of a beautiful woman. And then she has this deep relationship with that figure. And then the spell is broken when her husband kills a snake and the spirit of the house leaves them. But then she also comes back to her real life. But that story also draws on its own historical mythologies and literary traditions of the Middle East. So we can talk about that a little. And then we have the great poem by Mahfouz Darwish, who is considered the Palestinian national poet, produced a lot of poetry collections, was highly respected in the world. And the identity card is based in the real life legal situation where all Palestinians who either live in Israel or in occupied territories need to carry this identity card to enter Israel or exit it. And do keep in mind, a lot of Palestinians from occupied territories still work in Israel. They mostly work labor jobs and, high labor intensive jobs. And this Batakatul Hawiya, it is identity card, is kind of the story of that carrying that card as a marker, but as a marker of identity. But if you read the poem carefully, it also explains what stage is it that this worker in the poem, the protagonist of the poem or the speaker, what kind of heritage is he claiming and what is he doing to sustain life, and what would it take for him to finally have nothing to lose. And that's the kind of story that the poem tells. Now also there is a line there which says khamseen, that my number is 5,000, right? So some people say it's a code. If on your ID card in Israel or in occupied territory, if there is figure 5 in it, that tells the guards that you are an Arab. Okay, so do keep in mind that other than the Ashkenazi Jews who are European, most Middle Eastern Jews and Arab people, they pretty much look alike. You can't tell them apart, okay, because their features, the color of their skin is the same. So that's another function of the ID card, because it differentiates people to authority and what your views are on it. But so these are the three works that I had assigned you for this week. For the next week, we will be only dealing with two. I posted them on the website. So one is a V.S. Naipaul essay, and the other, I'm forgetting, I think it's a short story. But that's all we can cover today. All right, questions about any of the texts or one of the texts, I'll be very happy to answer them.
Yeah, I have a question about
Mhm.
My World of the Unknown. So was the snake meant to be a jinn?
Good point. Good. So yes, and that comes from the Arab tradition of storytelling, because if you've read your 1001 Night, or if you have even read Aladdin or watched it, the genies are a prominent figure in a lot of Arab folk tales. So we can read it elusively as a jinn. Just like if you watch any of the Western or American folk tales or fairy tales, they have their own figures, like they have demons, then they have angelic figures, they have mythologies of, alternative reality in which there are witches, and, there are a whole range of creatures, satyrs and all of the griffins. So similarly, the jinn is kind of the one of the figures that prominently you will see in speculative fiction in the Arab world. Yes. So we can clearly read it as such. Make a loose connection that, first of all, going back to these parallel words. So in a lot of stories that involve these kind of experiences, what we are led to believe in the Muslim Arab tradition is that there is a parallel world in which these creatures live, right? Or they live in the same world, but there is a curtain that divides us from them, right? And sometimes that can be breached, right? When they enter our part of reality, or we can enter their part of reality. So the experience will be different. And that snake we know is not the snake that she has been seeing, but that snake we can assume is either part of the alignment with this figure that who visits her, or maybe it's part of the understanding that the snakes around the house are part of that reality. So or it could be just she imagining or thinking it. I mean, we can read it any way. Part of it is also not just magical, but also we can also read it as someone who is not happy in her married life and has no other creative outlet. So this person could have also created her own reality, right? But what doesn't allow us to do that is because we have seen Anisa, who lived in the house before this. And she has absolutely lost her rational way of dealing with things. So we can assume that she had the same kind of experience, but she wasn't able to pull back. Whereas our protagonist, luckily or unluckily, is able to come out of that, right? But either way, I mean, there's a lot to read, in between the lines in the story. Okay, Shrika has a question. In Mahfouz's Zabalawi, each of the 6 people he encounters seems to point him in a different direction. Does this imply that Zabalawi isn't a real person, but rather a representation of? That's a really good question. Maybe that there could be a real Zabalawi, but it could be kind of a mercurial outlaw figure that everyone tries to explain, and then everyone tries to say, oh, you'll find him there, you'll find him there. So I tend to believe that now remember, the Zabalawi figure itself is based in real life characters from Egyptian and Arab history. And these people were called marabouts, right? They were dervishes, and they usually were itinerant in their job, and they pandered to population for spiritual healing and things like that. In most cases, their presence was illegal, and they were heavily controlled by the government because the government didn't want them to have that kind of a parallel power. So figure of Zabalawi itself is based in real life characters who live on the fringes of the of the society, but are revered by a lot of people because of the spiritual aspects assigned to them. And every culture pretty much has these kind of figures. So if United States, if you want to go by the Western mythology, it's the figure of the outlaw or the figure of the Lone Ranger, right? Or the gunslinger. Similarly, if you go to India, it's the figure of the sadhu, right? The person who's a spiritual person, but leaves the society and lives in the jungle and occasionally walks into a village and people do respect them and revere them and ask them to pray for them. So Zabalawi falls into the same category of people. Now, we also know through the story that he's wanted by the government, so he doesn't stay at one place. So there are enough hints in the story to tell us that there is someone named Zabalawi who is considered to be a spiritualist and have spiritual powers. What we could also read the reaction of these six people is also how in the popular culture, how people can have opinions about a thing or a person and how they get disseminated. Think of it in terms of social media. You know, in social media, you can make a total fabricated story. And since there are people who would either buy into it or uncritically share it, you can suddenly make something go viral that actually did not happen. So in this world too, we don't know if Zabalawi has that kind of power to cure people, right? But if there is a belief, then that either is based in there being an actual Zabalawi figure and people narrating his story of the healings that he has done or things like that. So all of those things are at play over here. But also, like, remember, he goes from the most formal part of the culture, from the office of a lawyer to an administrator, and then slowly he's now going into people who are artists, who work with their imagination, and down to, if you plot the movement, it's from the fringes of the Cairo culture, from the elite culture of Cairo, to all the way down to the artistic part, the poor part of Cairo. So it's also his entry into the older culture of Cairo. So that has something to say about the story too. I mean, architecturally, if you plot it, where he's going. But I think one thing that the poem does beautifully is that if people are accustomed to thinking stereotypically, right, about the Middle East, what we do is we just read the symbol, this person did this, right? And we always like, well, oh man, these are terrible people. What he's trying to complicate is the picture. If you look at all the lines, right? So the first thing we learn is this is a person who works. And he's mobilizing all the stereotypes there too, right? One of the stereotypes about Palestinians in right-wing Israeli factions is that they are breeders, right? Because the fight is of numbers, right? How many Jews, how many Arabs live in Israel gets to decide what kind of a state it can be. So since they have to maintain the Jewish heritage of the state and political power of the Jewish population, the legal aspects of state of Israel have always been to reduce the numbers of Arabs, and that's a fact, right? So evictions and everything else is a part of that strategy. So he's mobilizing all those stereotypes. Like if you look at the refrain in the poem, which in Arabic is Sijjal, Ana Arabi, right? Write it down, I'm an Arab, because he knows that Arab is used as a derogatory term by the people to whom he is presenting his ID card, which are probably the military people from the state of Israel. And then he mobilizes, yeah, you know, I have 9 children, the 10th one is on its way, and he's not ashamed of it, right? That's who he is. Then he lays down his heritage and his claim to the land, right? So what he says is, you know, I don't come from a noble family. I have no claim like that. The only claim I have to this land is that for centuries, my ancestors and I, we have plowed this land. We have worked on it. That is our heritage. So he has a very humble background. And then he says, here is what I do. I go to this quarry and literally break rock to feed my family, right? What's there to be angry about? Because these are the things that every other human being will do. Take any job to feed their family. Any proud person would do. And then there is a line where he says, will you take this away too, right? Just like you took our orchards and you took our fields, right? And that is a historical fact. So then he is saying that if you do that, if you drive me to the wall, right, when I have nothing else to lose, then I will fight you back. So what the poem is doing is it's basically saying, instead of reading the sign here, Palestinians are violent people, let us give you an individual story of what would drive a person to fight or to violence. And if you read it humanistically, you will realize, oh, if this was done to me, I will do the same goddamn thing, right? Because he gives us this argument that at a certain point, when someone is driven to the wall and they have nothing else to lose, right? And if they are proud, right, and if they want to take a stand, then the only thing left to them is the very thing that they are blamed for, and that is violence. So I think that's what the poem does brilliantly in that way. Now, there are certain historical facts that we all should know, right? And those are that the Palestinian refugees, the Arab refugees, these are the people who were actually in the territories that become State of Israel. When State of Israel becomes the State of Israel, there are clashes. The Israeli militias were called Haganeh, right? They were the ones who ousted these villagers from their villages. And as the refugees left, wherever they decided to pitch a tent and become a camp, those became the refugee camps in Gaza as well as in the West Bank. And some of them were able to go into Jordan and elsewhere, right? So now there are two major Palestinian territories, West Bank, which was the land that belonged to Jordan, and Jordan ceded it to a future state of Israel. That is Jordanian land, right? And then there is Gaza. And Gaza at this point is the world's largest prison. It is surrounded by a 24-foot wall. It has two gates, one towards the Israeli side, one towards the Egyptian side. So on the Egyptian side, the Egyptians control what comes in, what goes out. On the Israeli side, Israelis control. So this is a captive population, right? And it's one of the most densely populated areas in the world. So this is the actual situation in which the Israelis, Palestinians are living. Now, they were traditionally mostly farmers, so every time State of Israel creates a new development, a new subdivision, what do? They take over the farms, right? So they will bulldoze an olive farm, and these are recorded as historical events. So all of these things play into the imagination of people who have decided they were going to take a stand for the little piece of land they have, and then they lay claim to that land. And so every act, administrative or other, into that territory then becomes a kind of aggression. And so all of that is packed into Palestinian politics and Mahmoud Darwish's poetry. And until the right-wing people came to power in Israel, Mahmoud Darwish was taught as an Arab poet in Israeli universities. You know, Israel has a huge liberal left, you know, that fights for more rights for the Israeli Arabs, 2 million of them, but also for the Palestinian rights. Israel itself is not a monolithic culture. So keep those things in mind. Just to clarify, I am a strong proponent of Palestinian right to self-determination, but I'm also very strongly in support of the right of State of Israel to exist. But I think they can do that if the world powers that be don't play their own games. I mean, just give the Palestinians their tiny little territory, you know, let it develop, and Palestinians are very highly educated and the most democratic people in the Middle East. So I think they can live in peace if they were accommodated. How do you think Trump moving the embassy to Jerusalem has fanned the proverbial flames of? I don't know if it has fanned the violence, but I think it's a huge breach of the Oslo Agreement, because what America needs to do is, if they really want to resolve the problem, right, is to basically at least respect both sides, right? And then work with it. By moving the embassy to Jerusalem, what American policy announcement was that, okay, we are taking sides and we are on the side of of Israel. And if you do that, then you cannot be a mediator. I mean, that's a political choice. That's why other presidents didn't do that, because they wanted to retain the right of being a mediating power in the conflict. But by moving the embassy there, other than all these other Arab regimes who rely on American support to exist, no one in the Muslim world is going to take America seriously. These things, I think it can very easily be solved, if America commits to it. And that's how. I mean, think of the territory. It's tiny. West Bank, Jordan already gave it to Palestinians, and Gaza. I mean, you build a nation state, sign peace with Israel, send your peacemakers, right? And ask the Arab countries to give as much money as possible to the newly rising Palestinian state to make it viable, right? And you have a thriving democratic Arab state, right? It doesn't take rocket science to solve the problem, right? But only if the world powers approach it, even-handedly, and not by picking one side over the other. Does the snake in my world of the unknown have parallels to the... This was a question asked by my other students too. I won't say it has parallels, because the snake in the garden is a Christian myth, right? And it is mythologized and represented in Christian theology as well as mythology. There is no story of the snake misleading Eve in the Islamic tradition. Actually, there is no story of Eve misleading Adam. Adam is the stupid one who makes the mistake in the Muslim tradition, and Eve just gets the punishment because she had a stupid husband. So that is a purely a Christian allusion, right? So it would be kind of a misreading to read it as the snake in the garden or snake of the Christian mythology. But you could say that it is a trope in Arab folklore, in 1001 Nights. Usually the jinn take the shape of a snake. Also, if you go by the Egyptian mythology, the pagan Egyptian mythology, the snake was a powerful symbol, right? For the pharaohs, you remember they wore it on their crown, right? So asp, the Egyptian asp, the snake that Cleopatra uses to commit suicide. So snake has a mythological status in the pre-Islamic Egyptian tradition, but nothing such as what we see in the Christian tradition. This presence in the house and has been driven to ultimate madness. And she knows that the husband will not threaten her relationship with this being, but another woman might, right? So it's kind of that kind of jealousy, because in her experience, this figure that she has had a long-term, what do you call it? Relationship in a way with, she knows that if she is evicted, then the woman of the house will get what she is losing. So I think that's the kind of thing that is at play. And it also kind of tells you of the sexism of the folktale genre itself. In most cultures, women are the ones who are represented as those who are easily misled, or who can be, the forces that target them more easily. But in this case, I think it is more than just that. I think it is also that she is unhappy in her marriage and she feels like she's not being heard. So in a way, if you just want to do a realistic reading of the story, she just creates her own reality, her own fantasy. And that could stem from isolation. It could stem from some kind of mental illness as well. But it could also be a very imaginative escape from reality or from the pain of life. And we all do that in so many ways. Fantasy or fantasizing or daydreaming is a way of escape, from the harshness of life. Okay, so I guess there are no questions. So I will then see you next week, right? And in the meantime, if you have any questions, just send them my way and I'll be happy to answer. So this concludes this edited version of a live lecture. I'll be back with more, and please keep an eye out for these, and I hope these are useful to you. Thank you so much, and as always, peace and love.